Hey folks, this video is going to be an introduction before we begin Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 4 and 5, if you remember, take place in the throne room of God, where John goes up and he sees what is happening with God the Father and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, where Jesus receives this scroll, and we know that he is going to be able to open it and that things are going to happen. Starting in chapter 6, we see some of those events start to unfold. But before we start trying to dissect the events that unfold after the opening of that scroll, and when we get into the trumpets and the bowls that are poured out later, I want to talk a little bit about how we might interpret the timing of these events, because it has changed over history, and there might even today still be some disagreement about when these events are going to take place. Understand that this is a very brief overview. I don't have time to go into, or probably the knowledge, to go into all of the church history and the development of thought and philosophy over the years, but I do want to make you familiar with some terms as we start talking about the timing of these events. There are four basic views on the timing of these events. And in the early days of the church, there was a lot of thought, a lot of consideration given to a time frame that is mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. And there's a lot of discussion today about whether this number is literal or figurative, but it shows up 6 times in the book of Revelation. It says, and he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. In verse 3, he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. And so it goes on for 6 different times in Revelation chapter 20. It mentions 1,000 years. Another word for this is the millennium, or the millennial kingdom. Let me start with the 4 basic views and the words that describe them. We'll talk about how church history has gotten us to a place where we think we are today. The 4 words are preterist. We're going to define all of these. Historicist, idealist, and then futurist. Let me make a little timeline so that we can talk about the basics of what people would hold to these views would think about the timing of events. So let's make just a little timeline. It's going to go off in both directions. We will start at 4 BC, which is the year that we believe Jesus was born, based on some dating issues. Early on, we built the calendar around the year 0, but history has revised some of that timing to understand, based on who was in power, that Jesus was probably born in 4 BC. And we know that John is writing in about 100 AD. So John is about here, and we know the cross was about 30 AD. So we're going to put the cross there. Let's also put today on the chart. So we'll say here 2000, the year AD 2000. Let's put an ellipsis here to know that some undetermined amount of time might pass as we go into the future. And then we will come to the end of days, at which point we will have the second coming of Christ, second coming, and then the millennial kingdom. So I'll put the kingdom here. There have been over time people who would disagree about this second coming, whether it is before the initiation of this 1,000-year reign, or after the initiation of the 1,000-year reign, or after the end of the 1,000-year reign. but both of them are going to come after what we'll call the end of days for right now. So a preterist person, a person who held to a preterist view, would believe that all of the events of Revelation actually have already happened. So a preterist is going to go here. They would believe that all of the judgments of Revelation unfolded and culminated in the fall of the temple, at the fall of the temple in AD 70. And so a preterist thinks that all this stuff has already happened and we are only waiting on the coming of Christ. I'll skip over here to idealist, who would believe that all of these things in Revelation are just a depiction of the cosmic battle of good and evil, that it's all symbolic, that none of the symbolism represents any actual event in history. So it is an allegory or just symbolic of the cosmic battle between good and evil. And all of it can be interpreted symbolically. A futurist is going to hold to this kind of idea where at the end of days, the judgments of Revelation will be inaugurated at the end of days. And so those events are still future to us in AD 2000. A preterist would believe that all of these events were prior even to when John wrote them down, and that they ended around AD 70. There are a few who would say that the events unfolded as far as the fall of the Roman Empire in the early 400s. But a futurist believes that these events are still future to us today in the year 2026. And a historicist would believe that these events were future to John, the things that are to take place after this were after John, but they are continuing to unfold over time and will culminate at the end of days. So they've already begun. We're experiencing some of it now, and it will continue until the end of days. That is a very rough outline of how the timing might work from different points of view. So let's talk about where these ideas came from and which one we might choose to interpret Revelation as we go through this study. Now, the very earliest of Christians, so most early scholars over here, held to a futurist view. Now, they were expecting a 1,000-year reign of Christ in the future. I'm just going to put millennium. And this is understandable for these very early scholars. I'm actually going to number this, number 1, so we can see where we're going. They were expecting a millennium in the future, but they were living back here. They were living in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. And so they were expecting a kingdom to come in the future to them, not necessarily future to us. So they were expecting a 1,000-year reign of Christ to come. Now, around the year 400, circa 400, around the year 400, there was a proposal that the millennium had actually begun with the death of Christ. So let me write something down and I'll explain it in just a second. So around 400, that the millennium had already begun was the idea. It began with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Because they had experienced prior to the year 400, Christians had experienced a lot of persecution. Let me put this down. So we went from persecution. Then in 313 AD, Emperor Constantine of Rome got saved and legalized Christianity. So Christians were no longer going to be thrown into the gladiator arena or burned or otherwise tortured. And then after Constantine, the Roman Catholic Church, the development of the universal church, it grew and it was successful. The church was very successful. Even after Rome itself fell, the church continued to grow and thrive. And for a long time, the church was almost a governing authority over the Western world. So Rome falls, but the church continues. And this idea that the millennium had already begun was based on the fact that they started to see or started to compare the sufferings of Christians in those first couple of centuries, and then the end of suffering, and what they saw as the conquest of the world under the Christian flag as fulfillment of what was going on in Revelation. So they thought, well, the millennium must have begun with Christ. So the church is growing and thriving in the West. Augustine, around 400 AD, really liked this idea, but Augustine really, he took an idealist view of this. Let's put an arrow up here where we get to Augustine. Some of you might say Augustine. I say Augustine. So we're going to put Augustine here, roughly around the year 400. He liked this idea that the millennium had already begun, but he also saw a lot of these events as symbolic and as allegory. And so he sort of ran with this idea that the 1,000 years was not literal, and that he allegorized even resurrection, where today I think we see that we expect a bodily resurrection in the future, but the resurrection that happens in Revelation, he would have cast it as a spiritual resurrection that comes with salvation. And he also allegorized Satan's banishment to the abyss as a binding of Satan that happens as the church grows. And so he did allegorize a lot of this. He did not, because he did not believe in a literal 1,000 year reign of Christ. This view is called amillennialism. The A on the front of it means, without or in the absence of. So Augustine would have been an amillennial philosopher. His philosophy would have been amillennialism, and so took this sort of idealist approach to how Revelation should be interpreted. So after Augustine, which was in around the year 400, we get up to the year 1000, and Christ has not returned. If we think that this literal 1,000 year reign started with Christ, and we get to the year 1000, and all these things are not all, we haven't reached the end of days yet. And so they figure that something in their accounting has gone wrong. And so the interpretation centered around figuring out not about the 1,000 year millennium and when that was going to happen, but who were the seven heads of the beast that we see in Revelation that can be interpreted as seven kingdoms. And so they were looking at the events that were currently unfolding and saying, which of these current events were described in Revelation. And so they started before us. We're going to look at our history in the year 1000 in this area. We're going to look back and see which events in history might have already been fulfilled in Revelation and which are still to come. So we get this idea that the events are continuing to unfold. It doesn't really happen. I hate to put that it happened around the year 1000, but it is a result of this year 1000 passing. And this kind of thought continues on for most of the Middle Ages, until we get to the Protestant Reformation, until we get to the Enlightenment. This idea is going to persist, that these events began with Christ and started unfolding and then will continue to unfold in our own future. So after the year 1000, current events were interpreted as part of Revelation. As some of the judgments that happen in Revelation. So once we get post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant Reformation, and post-Enlightenment, up around the year 1700, the idea was proposed that all of Revelation has actually already occurred. And this was proposed around the year 1700. Let me put that down. The idea was proposed that all of it occurred in this window. That's why we're in the preterist column, that all of Revelation happened before AD 70, when the temple was destroyed by the Roman Empire. And these people who held to this view, thought that the world was going to continue to get better and better. Because remember, the church has been spreading and thriving. They're not taking a historicist view, but I'm still pointing at this arrow, that things under the church have been getting better. The church has been growing. The gospel has been victorious. That we get the missions movement, where missionaries are going into the far corners of the world to try to take the gospel to all people groups, because it says that in the end, people from every nation and tribe and tongue will be saved before Christ comes again. And so this is where we get this forward march with the gospel to try to usher in the kingdom by seeing people saved from all corners of the planet. So they are anticipating, they anticipate the kingdom to grow or to spread this 1,000 year reign of Christ. They're not necessarily taking it literally, but they anticipate that the kingdom will grow and conquer the world for Christ. And then at the end of that symbolic 1,000 year reign, that Jesus is going to come again at the end to set up his kingdom after, his second coming is going to be after the ushering in of his kingdom, because of the growth of the church, because of the growth of the gospel, the spread of the gospel around the world. So they think that the kingdom is going to grow and conquer, and that everything is going to get better and better and better. And then at the end of that, Jesus is going to come again for his second coming. So these people are going to be post-millennials, in that they believe that Jesus is going to come at the end, or after his kingdom has been established. Now, this idea really fell apart in 1914. In 1914, World War I began, and it was a shock to people who thought that the world was going to get better and better, and that the gospel was going to spread and transform this world into the kingdom of Christ. And then this really horrific world war takes place. And so maybe the gospel doesn't have the foothold in the world that we think it has. And then obviously we get World War II and Nazism, fascism, communism after that. And so the idea that the world is going to improve until the kingdom has taken over the earth, and then Christ will come to sit on his throne and reign, this kind of falls apart at that point, because it's clear that the world is not getting better and better and better. And so today, most people fall over here into this futurist camp. Make sure I've still got everything numbered. Most people fall into this futurist camp and consider that the events of Revelation are still future to us. Dispensationalism is the predominant view today. And it's the idea that there have been periods in history where God communicated and related to his people in slightly different ways. There are a couple of different branches within dispensationalism. I will say that there is a divide over whether some of the events have already of Revelation have already happened in the past and will continue into the future, or whether all of the events of Revelation are still future to us. So while I don't want to put any dispensationalists really in the camp of a historicist, there are some who think that there is a possibility that some of the events of Revelation have already happened. So I will put historicist if y'all promise to understand that they're not really in the same camp as this side. That the 1,000-year reign did not begin with Christ. The 1,000-year reign is still in the future, but some of the events of Revelation might have already happened prior to AD 2000, and there are still some that will happen as we get closer to the end of days. There is a divide in dispensationalism over the distinction or relationship between Israel and the church that we won't get into in this video, but there is, just know that that is one of the defining markers of what would separate a classical dispensationalist. If you have a Scofield Study Bible in your house that belonged to your grandparents, they would be a classical dispensationalist. The views in the Scofield Bible would be from a classical dispensationalist point of view. More progressive dispensationalism, don't be afraid of the word progressives. These people still hold to the literal interpretation of Scripture. But a progressive dispensationalist is not going to see the divide between Israel and the church the same way that a classic dispensationalist would. And another thing that might distinguish a classical dispensationalist from a progressive dispensationalist is on the timing of the rapture. And we'll do another video about the options for the timing of the rapture separate from this video. It will come later. There are also several views about that. But dispensationalists all believe that Christ will come before he sets up his kingdom, which makes them premillennial. So don't get that view confused with these two words that I'm about to say, that the timing of the rapture, a classical dispensationalist would hold to a pre-trib or pre-tribulation view of the rapture, that Christ is going to come and take his church, rapture his church out of the earth before the wrath of God falls onto the people who are left behind. If you have read the Left Behind books, you are familiar with a pre-trib view of the rapture. Other dispensationalists, more progressive dispensationalists, might hold to a post-tribulation view of the rapture, where Christ is going to come, rapture his church, and immediately set up his kingdom. And so the tribulation will not happen in between the rapture and the establishment of the 1,000-year reign. So a classic dispensationalist would believe that there is a rapture, a tribulation, and then the 1,000-year kingdom. And a more progressive dispensationalist would believe that there is the tribulation, the rapture, and the second coming at the same time, and then the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. Most modern scholarship falls in this area. So we're going to take a dispensationalist view of Revelation, and we're going to assume that at least some of the description, especially in the early ones, in the breaking of the seals, some of this stuff is sort of general and might describe events that have already happened or things that are continually happening, things that happen across history. But we are going to assume that most of the events of Revelation are still future to us in the year AD 2000, that the end of days will come and that the second coming of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom will happen in that order. Again, the rapture might come before Jesus comes and defeats his enemies. We might be raptured out and then have the tribulation and then Jesus defeats his enemies and sets up his kingdom, or the rapture and the second coming and the defeat of Christ's enemies might coincide with the setting up of his kingdom. We can make that decision later. But for now, we're going to assume as we start Revelation chapter 6 and 7, that most of the events that happen in Revelation are future still to us. And that a lot of these things are going to happen at the end of days. We'll look at the 70 weeks of Daniel and see how it relates to the coming of the end of days. That also will come in a later video. But for now, I want to make you familiar with the views on the timing of the events of Revelation. We're not going to take a preterist view that says that all of these events happened in history and finished in AD 70. We're not going to take a historicist view that says that the millennium actually began with Christ, because here we are 2,000 years later, and all these events haven't unfolded. Christ hasn't come and set up his kingdom. We're not going to take an amillennial view and say that the 1,000 years is only symbolic and that all of these are just descriptions of an ongoing cosmic battle. We are going to take the view that the events of Revelation, we're going to take them as literally as possible and take the view that the second coming of Christ is still in our future and the setting up of his kingdom is still in our future. And these events relate to that. So those are the 4 basic views of Revelation. Again, this is a very brief and very generic overview. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments. I may or may not be able to answer them. I might just direct you to some books where you can read more about it. But I want you to know as we go forward that this is the view that I will be taking. I personally waffle between a classic dispensationalist view and a progressive dispensationalist view in my own personal life. Don't hate me for it. We're all going to be in heaven together, but I'll do my best to try to explain why I believe what I believe as we go through these events. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for coming.